Okay, great. Well, it's nice to see everyone back here again. This is the sixth and final installment of the Institute for Public Knowledge series on COVID and inequality. We've had a great set of conversations. I see some familiar names, if not faces here. So for those of you who've been coming, welcome back. If you haven't been coming and you're interested, we started an Institute for Public Knowledge YouTube channel this year. And we have recordings of our events, including the 5 previous conversations in this series there. So please come back. Like everyone, I'm hopeful that in the not too distant future, this fall, we're able to be together in person in some way. I know that these conversations have been rich and engaging, and I've learned a lot from them, but they are missing that special something that you get from being together on the 5th floor at 20 Cooper Square. I think the substance of the events themselves are somewhat similar, at least insofar as it comes to the content of the formal discussion, but what's really different is the interactions that we have outside of the seminar, before the receptions after. There's not that same thickness of interaction that leads to all kinds of serendipitous things, and that issue is the subject, in a way, for tonight's conversation, which is about contact and distance and the social life we will all be part of in the post-pandemic world that we can't wait to enter. It's probably premature to talk about post-pandemic world. I think we'll hit post-pandemic before we hit post-COVID, and I hope we get to post-pandemic soon. So the way we're going to do this is we have 4 truly extraordinary speakers tonight, and I'm just going to turn the floor over to them without giving lengthy introductions. We'll hear first from Natasha Schull, who's a professor in the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication at NYU. We'll then hear from Paul DiMaggio, who's my colleague in sociology department. We'll then hear from Meredith Broussard from the journalism department at NYU, and then from Dana Boyd, the founder and director of Data and Society, and also someone who's always around NYU. I don't really know in what official capacity, but we take as much of Dana as we can get because she makes the room more interesting, whether it's online or in person. We'll hear from each one of our speakers, and then you should know that you're invited to weigh in, to ask questions at any point. You can put it in the Q&A box, at the bottom of the Zoom screen. I will read them and do my best to make sure that each of the questions gets discussed. So again, thank you for being here. It's nice to see the faces of the speakers, and off we go. Natasha, the floor is yours.
Okay, I should be unmuted now, and I'm getting my screen where it needs to be. Hold on a second. Hi, everyone. Okay, is everybody seeing my first slide? All right. So I decided to begin with this image of me, which I pulled from a recording of a seminar I ran for nearly 2 hours a few weeks back, without being aware of my background scene, which, as you can see, included an upside down chair on the bed behind me, and a pillow without a pillowcase. And I thought I had done enough by covering up my old sweatshirt with a scarf, but clearly I was not being sufficiently vigilant. And so for tonight, I've removed the offending chair, but I kind of want to own this background as the context in which I prepared my remarks today on social distance and what happens to our evolving relationship with screens and the analog world, which is the prompt that Eric passed along to us to think about. So I'm going to do this quickly from the vantage of the experiential, subjective side of things, in keeping with my approach as an anthropologist of technology. So over the past 13 months, in which many of us have experienced reduced live contact with other human beings, along with the awareness that bodies, our own bodies and those of others, have become dangerous in their intimate connections to each other, and that also we need to stay apart to take care of each other. We have felt a state of languishing, which literally about 30 minutes before this event, I saw the New York Times article from today discussing this feeling and identifying it as being this curious mixture of stagnation and emptiness and muddling, in which we feel simultaneously moored and adrift, bored and anxious. So in my brief remarks, I want to address the role that consumer technologies play in the way that we regulate this state of languishing. And this, of course, was something that, as some of you know, I was researching and thinking about before the pandemic hit in a project on self-tracking technology. And arguably, the many dimensions of that project have become even more salient since the pandemic hit. So the things that we are supposed to track, that we are expected to track and quantify, I'd say have multiplied. So checking the news, tracking our symptoms, testing our bodies, tracing our contacts, regulating our breath and stress levels. The array of things we're expected to be vigilant of by checking and tracking and tracing and testing and quantifying do seem to have multiplied, along with the technologies that have come on the scene to help us perform this work. And these technologies, you could say, embody an indirect form of power or governance at a distance, so to speak, that regulate our conduct and provide what elsewhere I have called algorithmic care, by which I mean the array of pre-programmed automated reminders and nudges and alerts, sometimes audible, sometimes visual, sometimes haptic, as we'll see in a moment, that are triggered when a tracked person, which could be oneself or it could be a loved one, crosses certain numeric thresholds, heart rate, number of steps, temporal durations, time between medication doses or hours of sleep, or geographic boundaries, the home, the school, etc. So since I think through cases, I'm going to quickly zip through a few. Here we see the Whoop respiration tracker, which allows symptom checking and also mediates, you could say, respiratory anxieties around COVID. And by mediate, I mean both relieves to some extent, but also provokes new anxieties and a need to keep checking. This site has abundant testimonial, sort of cautionary tales regarding the literal existential value of remaining in close contact, so to speak, with one's physiological data, as in this narrative from one Ashley that ends, if I hadn't had my Whoop, I likely would have continued working that weekend in the pharmacy, exposing others. This next technology here is marketed as wearable mood management, and it doesn't directly invoke COVID, but it did first start appearing, at least in my Facebook feed last March, alongside apps to help kids de-stress from Zoom classes and manage their attention and anxiety. This is meant for adults, although there's also tests with kids for it. And it elaborates a narrative of technologically facilitated resilience in the face of harmful stress by harnessing the power of touch. And I'll just read the quote here from one of the developers. It's based on the sense of touch, how touch makes us feel safe, and how touch has always been the single most important way for us to convey to each other that we are safe. So of course, this is very interesting in light of today's topic. I will play a very short clip from the product video.
Our fight or flight response kicks in, making it hard to focus and swim. Apollo rapidly restores balance to the nervous system by sending gentle waves of vibration.
Sorry.
Offering you control of stress, so you can tackle whatever comes next. The technology is new, but it feels familiar. Apollo's waves work with our body's natural response to touch. It feels like a hug in a a bad day, a deep breath of ocean air.
So this idea of hugging has particular resonance, I think, in these times, that it can sort of replace or be a proxy for the hug. I also just will call out if any of you noticed that this comes also in an ankle form, and I couldn't help thinking, of course, of criminal electronic monitoring that's actually derived from the same technology. When the woman who's anxious in bed at night, probably on lockdown, puts an ankle bracelet on herself. So I'll end with just a quote from a student in the seminar I was leading in the very picture that I showed you earlier. Our class that day was on time management. It's a class called Data and the Self, and we were specifically discussing productivity apps for laptops and phones, and the students were drawing a number of connections to their use of apps under the new temporal circumstances of the pandemic and the challenges that it poses to remote work. And I'll just play the audio for that quickly.
I feel like for me, because like classes and everything is in front of a screen, I feel like the more time I spend on a screen, I guess I feel productive. But then like to bring up an argument, I feel like for procrastination, I also spend that in front of a screen. So it's like, I don't know, it's like a weird mix, because on one hand, in front of a screen, I feel really productive. But on the other hand, I can be like really unproductive and just like waste a lot of my time.
So she goes on with that thought, but I love this notion of the weird mix. And I want to resist a too quick or pat diagnosis of what that weird mix is, but I do want to suggest in closing that it's important to acknowledge the pharmacon-like effects of the various technological mediations I've skimmed through here. In other words, their ambivalent functions as poison and remedy, symptom and cure. They come on the scene to mediate the anxiety and boredom of languishing that accompany this persistent, pervasive existential threat and social distance. They make us feel at once safer and more at risk, intruded upon and more alone, anxious, but with various means of relief at our fingertips. So we doom scroll and then we use our breathing app to get to sleep. So I'll end on that note.
Natasha, that was great, and you didn't use your full 10 minutes, so I get to ask you one question related to this. I can't help but ask. I mean, we were very intimate with our devices before this began, and we've gotten even more so. And you know that it's not like there's an empirical finding that would allow you to kind of say something definitive about it. But I wonder, from the conversations you've had and the observations you've made, do you sense a kind of a backlash of kind of more pervasive feeling that the invasiveness of the technology, feels creepy and disappointing, so that you see a kind of a more powerful longing for human contact, kind of deeper sense of the way that the machines kind of fail to satisfy us? Or, in the end, do you really see the ambivalence, like that? We want that, but we want the face-to-face and the human, but we also are intrigued by all these possibilities to get away from our Apollo machine instead.
I absolutely see ambivalence, but I also see more awareness of the ambivalence. People are able to articulate it. There was more student conversations from a couple of weeks ago where the students talked about how they were resisting something that before they'd been in a mode of abiding. So they will just leave their phone at home and go outside. And you can find these narratives all over the internet of people who, when thrown up against themselves and their technologies at home, realize, because it's all made so salient, these mediations, just how unhappy, lonely, et cetera, that they are. So there's certainly some potential of hope that gets articulated within this ambivalence.
Interesting. Thanks, Natasha. Paul, we're going to pass it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much.
So you should take off your Apollo device now.
What do you mean?
You can stop the digital hugging. We just focus on the.
Okay. So thanks very much, Eric. It's great to be here. And one of the things that I do at NYU is I teach courses in social networks. So this gives me an opportunity to reflect on how the pandemic has changed the way that we relate to one another and also the structure of the networks that come out of those interactions. And in doing it, I'm actually going to make some use of an assignment that before I knew I was going to be here today, I gave to my undergraduates, which was to reflect in an essay on how the pandemic had changed their social networks, who they speak with about and get social support from and give social support to. So I'm going to draw on that. There's a lot to say. I'm going to read more than I like to in order to keep the time, but I'm going to focus on two questions. First, what has quarantining, isolating, and distancing done to the quality, the timbre of social relations, and especially incidental relations in public spaces? And how might this change when the pandemic is over? Second, how has the pandemic rewired our social networks, changed the people we interact with, and with what likely consequences in the future? Most of what I'm saying is about people like us, people who live in cities and blue states and take the pandemic seriously. There's a whole swath of the country to which I suspect what I'm saying is irrelevant, the people who've basically ignored the pandemic and not done much about it. First, let me talk about the qualitative side. I think that most people, or many people at least, have failed to appreciate how profoundly social distancing violates tacit and deeply ingrained rules of social interaction. Psychologists have learned a lot recently about the extent to which interpersonal sympathy is hardwired. We mirror the behavior of others and in some ways experience other people's behavior as our own. When we interact with other people, we engage in what psychologists call affiliative social tuning. We unconsciously align our perspectives with theirs. And when a conversation is going well, we align physically as well with bodily movements and gestures. With close friends, physicality is important. Hugs and handshakes are enchanting rituals that validate relations of trust and affection. And even with strangers or distant acquaintances, we enter into the world with what phenomenologists call the attitude of everyday life. Assuming that others know the rules of interaction, that they're committed to the success of the interaction, and that their behaviors and ours will be mutually legible. Social distancing profoundly disrupts this deep and basic sense of trust. Among friends and family, we code relationship closeness through physicality, so that not hugging or shaking hands with a close friend or a family member seemed at first like a betrayal of trust. Less noticeably, but perhaps more consequentially, it forced us to redefine contact with humans outside our households as threats rather than opportunities. This required an emotional reprogramming that violated well-established norms of interpersonal courtesy, learning to stay distanced, avoiding small talk, and treating every stranger as a potential lethal threat. So one question is, once the pandemic ends, how long will it take us to unlearn these lessons of fear and distrust? I think there are two problems. First, it was really hard to develop in this kind of awareness and style that goes so much against ordinary socialization. And when something is achieved that with that much effort, abandoning it is going to be effortful as well. But second, and this may be more important, the persistence of the pandemic produces ambiguity. We don't know, at least in casual public interactions, who's been vaccinated and who hasn't been. And there's a lot of ambiguity, or at least variation in personal confidence in the efficacy of the vaccines themselves. So everyone seems to be formulating their own rules. And as a result, casual interactions in public may be complicated for a long time. This matters, I think, because casual public interactions are the algae of the social food chain. Any particular interaction is of trivial importance, but together they constitute an infrastructure of sociability. As Irving Goffman famously argued, social interactions have a double character. On the one hand, they're often about something. There's often some instrumental purpose, but they also serve as little rituals that, when conducted successfully, validate the self, produce a sense of well-being, and instill self-confidence. Social scientists have thought a lot about the corrosive effect of microaggressions, and rightly so, but we've paid less attention to what might be called microaffirmations. the small successful interactions that contribute to our collective well-being and on which larger patterns of sociability ride. And I think we're learning that those are equally important now that they've become problematic and no longer taken for granted. So this is one of several changes that the students in my social networks class observed in their essays. They noted the loss of incidental encounters in classrooms, hallways, study spaces, coffee shops, and other public places. One student summarized the effects of the pandemic on his social network in this way. In this he spoke for almost every essay. He wrote, "My strong ties have gotten stronger and my weak ties have gotten weaker." Other students echoed this observation. And we can't generalize from elite university students, but I think that many of us will have observed something like this ourselves. So what else did they say? First, their family ties became a lot more important. Students reported relying on parents for emotional support in a way that they hadn't since the beginning of high school. This was especially true of students who returned home. The lockdowns enabled very different conversations between me and my parents, one wrote. And after a few days, we were even eating meals together. But it was also true of those who interacted with parents by Zoom. Indeed, several reported that they had developed close relationships with parents from whom they had been estranged at the beginning of the pandemic. And many others reported deepening relationships with siblings. Second, friendship networks often narrowed to close friends. For the fresh people and sophomores, these were often friends from high school. For upper class people, they were often friends from their own class, sometimes also old friends. They couldn't always have predicted who the close friends would be, but there was a selection of a few people with whom they were close, and a lot of more people where the relationships atrophied. This was particularly true of casual friendships that were built around shared activities. A number reported that friendships that had been based on membership in student groups or going out to movies or listening to music together or playing sports were among the first to fall by the wayside. These are relationships for which the activities themselves provide the scaffolding for sociable conversation. And once the activities end, there's nothing to talk about. So this contraction of networks and retreat into what sociologists call strong ties has potentially important consequences. The members of one's strong tie networks are ordinarily people with whom one has a lot in common. This is a finding of a lot of research. The strong tie networks are more homogeneous in composition, and because people's strong ties tend to know one another and be close, they're more culturally and ideologically homogeneous as well. By contrast, what are called weak tie networks are typically more diverse, and the relationships in them are ordinarily more segregated from one another, providing a more sustained kind of diversity. Weak ties extend one's reach into varied corners of the social world, providing new information and new perspectives. As Jane Austen put it in Persuasion, removal from one set of people to another will often include a total change of conversation, opinion, and idea. Jane Austen's one of my favorite microsociologists and one of the best until Jerry Seinfeld. Georg Simmel argued that what we now call weak ties constitute our individuality and are the source of cosmopolitan perspectives. So to what extent will the retreat into strong ties change as people are vaccinated and get back into the world? I'm not sure, but I think it's an important question. First, because the world in which there are fewer weak ties is one in which there's less contact between people of different ethno-racial origins, political beliefs, cultural tastes, avocational interests. It's a world that's less open and less cosmopolitan. It's also a world in which people, especially people without inherited advantages, lack the information that weak ties ordinarily provide and the opportunity to build mentoring or sponsorship relationships that can emerge from casual contact and develop out of that. Several students, all of whom were from non-elite, were not from elite US backgrounds, mentioned that the pandemic had made it more difficult for them to talk to professors, that they felt less comfortable going to Zoom office hours than they did walking up to a professor after class and starting a conversation and letting a relationship build in that way. And they were concerned that they would lack the mentoring that they had hoped to get, might not have people to write recommendations because of this. I suspect the same is true in a lot of workplaces that are working remotely, where distanced work has reduced the vitality of informal networks, limited the circulation of information, and done so most of all to people who were outsiders by virtue of race, gender, or stage in the career cycle. So in places where people have isolated and observed distancing for the past year, I think there are going to be at least two challenges. The first will be to rebuild the fabric of sociability in public places and to recover the constitutive trust that we used to take for granted. And the second will be to rebuild the infrastructure of weak ties and to go out of our way to ensure that students and workers whose networks were disrupted at a critical time in their lives have the opportunity to acquire mentors and sponsors and have their talents recognized. So thank you.
Thanks, Paul. That was terrific. I mean, we don't have time to engage much, but I want to know what one thing that's interesting is, it seems to me like in the same quarters where people have taken the pandemic very seriously and changed their behavior, there's also been over the course of the year, at least a discursive or rhetorical commitment to inclusion and social change and to kind of doing something about the embarrassing levels of inequity and discrimination. And that's a rhetorical commitment. And one of the things that you're pointing out is how much on the, there is to observe on the practice side, how much kind of taken for granted norms and routines have been disrupted, and how important it will be for us, to really rework praxis as well. These problems are not problems that go away based on rhetorical commitments. So thank you. Meredith, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's great to be here tonight. Paul, I really liked what you said about how we're going to have to rebuild the infrastructure of weak ties. I think every day about how I really miss the people with whom I had weak ties in my community. And that's one of the things that I really am looking forward to getting back when we can have casual social interactions again. I don't think I realized until I lost them how much I valued those weak ties. So I'm going to talk tonight about the future. When I was thinking about the topic tonight, I thought about visions for the future. And specifically, what was the vision for the future that came down to us in the early internet era? So for many years, we were sold this vision of the future where everything would come to the door. I think that one of the really good manifestations of this is the movie Ready Player One, where everybody kind of lives at home and is obsessed with video games all the time and lives in virtual reality. But as part of this future, we would order groceries online and they would come to the door. We would talk to our friends online, and we could do our jobs from home instead of commuting. We would get all this time back because we weren't commuting, and we'd never have to leave home, and everything would come to us and everything would be automated. And in the pandemic, we've all had a taste of what this would be like. And this future sucks. Like, I've been home for a year and a half, and I'm sick of having things delivered. I'm sick of Zoom socializing. It's not as good as socializing in person. The future that we were told was coming, the screen-enabled future, the app-enabled future, it's not that great. So I think the big realization has been the value of the life that we lived when we were physically together. So it's very convenient that the groceries show up at the door and all the things show up at the door, but it's also really terrible. I would pay a lot of money just to like casually go shopping, for example, without the stress that we have about shopping nowadays. And one of the things that I was thinking about when I was thinking about the screen-enabled future is that the future that we've achieved via the pandemic is one of stark inequality, where the haves stayed home and the have-nots work delivery. That was also terrible. We need to do something about economic inequality. We need to do it now because economic inequality is growing and is called into stark relief by the pandemic. We also saw during the pandemic the widening of what we used to call the digital divide. In college classrooms, it was very clear which of the students had enough computer equipment and which didn't. You could tell which students had these high-speed connections that you could use for gaming, and which students were sitting in the parking lot at the local public library in order to get a connection. And so this is another thing that was not part of the narrative about the imaginary future. And it's another thing that we need to fix immediately. We need to have consistent access. If the internet is to be a shared resource, and if all information is to move online, and if all shopping and what have you is going to move online, then we need to have equal access to online resources. So if all of life is going to happen online, we should be providing the service to everyone for a very low cost, the way that we provide water or electricity to everyone for a very low cost. So what I'm saying is that the future that I'd like to see after the pandemic is a more equitable future. I'd like to see resources distributed more evenly. I'd like to see an end to racial discrimination and police violence against communities of color. I don't know that I'm optimistic this is going to happen immediately. And as far as what's going to happen when we emerge from our sheltering in place, I think that one thing I've noticed about myself, and I assume it's happening for other people, is that I am profoundly under-socialized right now. I go out in public now that I'm vaccinated, and sometimes it feels like I've forgotten how to act. I went antiquing the other day. I needed to buy something, and I went to this huge antique place, and it was very socially, I feel the need to tell you, it was very socially distanced, so it was very safe, and everybody's masked, blah, blah, blah. I feel very guilty, but I haven't gone to the store, which is crazy. But I was in the store, and there was this woman down the hallway, and she was in a wheelchair, and she was carrying a dog on her lap. And I have been really obsessed with my own puppy lately. And so I was looking at this woman's dog, and then I was thinking about my puppy, and I was thinking, oh, I guess I could have brought my dog to the store, blah, 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 my dog, my dog, my dog. And the woman said, oh, can I help you? And I realized I had been staring at her. Or she felt like I was staring at her. I was actually staring at her dog. I was staring, which was terrible and rude. And I felt extra bad because the woman was in a wheelchair, and I felt like, oh, she must think that I'm being horrible and staring because she's in a wheelchair, but really I was just staring at her dog, and I'm under socialized, and I felt terrible about this whole interaction. But it stands out to me because this is not something I would normally do. I would normally have it locked down enough that I would not do something like that. So I'm under socialized. A lot of us are under socialized. It's going to take some time to get our mojo back and to kind of remember how to act in public. And so we're all going to have to be extra kind to each other as that happens. We'll have to grapple a lot with the issue of what happens when under socialized people start to reconvene and are still pretty freaked out about COVID germs. Right? So we're now in the habit of behaving like COVID is everywhere, and it'll take a long time to get over that. We have this new measure of evaluating how comfortable people are with different COVID precautions. If any of you have arranged play dates for kids, there used to be just this this kind of overlay of figuring out food allergies and like what are the rules in the different households. And now there's this additional layer of, okay, who's comfortable with what level of COVID precautions, and how do we navigate that? How do we communicate it to the kids? How do we make sure that everybody's comfortable in this space together? Which is a lot of social engineering. So in the big picture, of the imagined future. What I've realized about my own imagined future is that I have completely thrown out the window the future that we used to think, or that I used to think was going to happen. The future where everything was going to become screen enabled. And it feels very liberating to have let go of that idea of the future. Eric, you asked Natasha a question earlier about whether technology was disappointing to her students, I believe. And technology has always disappointed me, honestly. But I felt like it was a mandatory part of the future. And now I'm actually able to imagine a future where technology is a partner and not a focus, that we are not driving toward a future where everything gets more and more technological and the human connections get less important, but that the human connections are valued and the technology takes a back seat. In my imagination, this is a future where people are kind to each other, where racial justice exists, where AI is deployed for justice and not purely to build wealth for a few. And that's the future I'd like to see. Thank you.
It's a great vision to leave us with. Thank you, Meredith. You know, I've been writing about social infrastructure a lot, and one of the arguments I find myself making is that we look for efficiency in so many areas of our lives. And you've kind of, in one of the things you discussed, you gave us a kind of portrait of a hyper efficient future lifestyle, you know, where we don't need to be slowed down by things like going outside of our home and engaging with other people. And I think that has been a fantasy for many, like kind of the idea of hyper efficiency. But in social life, it turns out that inefficiency is really useful, and that, you know, friction does wonders for us. You know, something about this period of time where, you know, we don't bump into one another quite so much, and we fear each other and avoid that interaction, has created this gaping hole in our lives. And I think a lot of us feel that. I will also say, I was on a Zoom event last night, because where else would one be? And someone made, I thought, a very excellent point, that there is a world of people for whom, you know, physical life creates all kinds of complications and challenges. You know, she was talking about children who have, anxiety issues and difficulty socializing face to face, and they have found a lot to gain, a lot to gain from in this new arrangement. And as much of a proponent as I tend to be of kind of physical life in the analog world, I had to take the point that there's probably some set of people who who are really doing better under these conditions. And she made the point that it's hard to escape the hybrid model that we've now created. There's probably no going back to a world that was like the one before. And we're probably on a trajectory to incorporate more and more of these, you know, efficient technological, you can do it from home services into our world. So one interesting question moving forward is, how do we develop those hybrids in a way that work for us? You know, what are the trade-offs going to be? What are the balances? Dana, I know you have the answer to all those questions and more, so jump on in.
Thanks, Eric. And it's so much fun to be with all of you here today. And to call out Eric earlier, he's like, she's somehow associated with NYU. I'm a visiting faculty member over at ITP, the Interactive Telecommunication Program, although it's a little hard to do that kind of interactivity from afar. This is such a fun panel because people are coming from such fun, different, and yet complementary angles. And I'm hoping to add to that. Because when we think about the human connections that are disrupted by the pandemic, we often think about the separation of family, the changes to dating and maintaining friendship. We think about children being taken out of school, people living in nursing homes that are not having visitors. And we know that work has changed. We've heard work come up in different ways here. But a lot of the conversations about work are, often jump to this idea of telework, right? And we've lived in this Zoomified world of mediated interaction for quite some time. Meanwhile, we also talk about people who are in essential work positions, who are in a different configuration as they think about how to keep distance from others, what it means to have that distance as they go about what they do. And of course, masks end up serving as this odd safety system, right? Being like, well, we're going to protect ourselves, but of course they also create their own form of separation, right? Making it hard to just feel comfortable, just chatting and relaxing and having that, deli conversation that so many of us value. And so when we often heard about technology, especially in those early days of the pandemic, and as others have pointed out, even before that, I'm thinking to Natasha's point, it's like, technology is going to be the amazing thing that'll help us connect in spite of everything. This will be great. Might not be perfect for human connection, but it's going to be good enough, certainly for this work context. And as Paul pointed out at one point, right, power dynamics have gotten in the way in profound ways, right? The ability to connect with somebody across power differentials is a huge challenge. And indeed, in most professional white-collar work contexts, we are seeing a lot of companies talking about how to better connect with people during the pandemic. And these dictates are always entertaining, right? Go organize tea over Teams, right? Go have those fun Slack channels to just chat with colleagues. Go use the Zoom sections to just chat with all the different people. And we see all of this kind of chatter. And many professionals who, long for a pre-pandemic world of breaks between meetings, and all the different ways of which they'd move around physical space, a lot of them still jumped in and were like, okay, well, we can find different ways of connecting. Now, of course, digital conferences are not the same, in no small part because, we have to admit that we actually never really went to conferences to go to conferences or the talks. In fact, the fact that you showed up today is kind of a miracle, because I have to admit, most of the conferences I went to was actually for the hallway and for the gossip in between. And here you are listening to us. So, bless you. And I think that's this interesting moment about how does those connections sort of work and what does it look like? But for one class of workers who I've been fascinated by lately, the telework reality brought with them a whole new kind of anxiety that's often missed from this dialogue. Government workers who had a lot of work to do during this period, they're subject to something called the Freedom of Information Act, and such that everything they leave as a digital trace is subject to other people's scrutiny and review. And so throughout their time, the integration of technology into the government was always a little slow. Just be careful of email. It's all traceable. And unlike lawyers, government official can't just write privileged and confidential at the top and not sweat it, which is like the total cheat of all the legal profession. Instead, it's like every single trace, every email utterance, every metadata of where your phone is at any given time. These are subject to laws that are designed to ensure the transparency of government. Those utterances, those digital traces, they can be obtained, taken out of context, and used against government workers. And so government workers actually have long relied on the physical space to be outside of the constant surveillance system, to pull each other aside and talk with colleagues, right? To go to conferences and maintain relationships with professionals in the field. Now, it's not that these interactions, these casual, lightweight interactions, are all about, sharing state secrets. It's often these informal ways in which those weak ties are maintained, right? It's about human connection and appreciation, acknowledgement, the realization that we are humans interacting. And so if you paid attention in government before the pandemic, it was people standing outside in the hallway, telling jokes, talking about their weekends, those moments of acknowledging one another, the little kinds of connections that make it all feel okay, the glue in a high stress work environment, right? Because for many of those government workers, the work of doing government work is itself extremely stressful. So this moment of those lightweight connections of being like, okay, we're in it together, we're on that mission together. And under normal circumstances, it is those standing out in the hallways, and it's the off hours, it's the going and getting a drink with folks after work. But in a digital world, all of this is surveilled, and most of it is off limits. And so for the last year, I've been embedded inside a US agency trying to conduct the largest operation that is conducted during peacetime, the enumeration of the entire population, right? Democracy's data infrastructure, better known as the US Census. And this extremely high stakes affair takes place every decade and forms the statistical basis for apportionment, redistricting, and federal funding. It involves literally hundreds of thousands of workers who are coordinated in an attempt to count every person in the country. Now, this time around, there was a pandemic. As a result, the data are not yet out, which is a little complicated at this moment. Was also unprecedented weather conditions. There was a toxic partisan context. There are many things to say about the 2020 census, but in the context of this panel, I want to note of what it meant for so many of these workers to be doing this in a telework context, right? Because most of these workers who were coordinating all of this were sitting in their home rather than sitting in the buildings inside Suitland in Maryland. And so those who are trying to do this were doing it without having that space to connect as humans. They spent an entire year under an entirely new level of a microscope. All meetings, all phone calls were tracked. Few felt comfortable joking around in their antiquated version of Skype for Business because they didn't modernize beyond that in advance because telework wasn't normal. None of this was designed for a large scale system like this. And so junior employees, it wasn't just like Paul mentioned of not being able to pick up the phone call or feel comfortable talking to somebody, in the office hour situations. They were afraid to even chat or acknowledge anybody in another division because that would leave a trace of an interaction, even if that was just to say hello. So all of those things that used to happen in the Suitland cafeteria where people would stand online and be like, what you working on? What's going on in your division? All of that was gone. They didn't know what was happening in any other thing. They had to operate within their hierarchies, what was permitted to be communicated, what was approved in terms of who was allowed to relate to whom under what terms. And they had to do it realizing that anything that they did would be taken out of context by what has now begun, which is a whole slew of lawsuits. So on top of that, of course, partisan interference was such that they were not allowed to communicate. There were no formal communications allowed with external groups. And since there were no conferences, there were none of that lightweight, conversations over, coffee and tea in the middle of the day. So without those casual interactions, it's not just that the organization itself became more and more brittle, and it did, because people didn't know what was going on, but all the forms of trust started to disintegrate inside the government agency, and even worse, in the relationship between the government's agency and outside. Because without those encounters at conferences, without those realizations that these government workers are under this high stress environment trying desperately to do it, people saw what they saw through highly mediated and formalized way and began to distrust the entire system. And we are at a moment right now where that 2020 census is distrusted up and down the system, right? People don't trust the Bureau, they don't trust the data, they don't trust the whole apparatus. And even those enumerators who walk door to door, who become normally the field version of like being able to trust in this institution, it's pretty creepy to have somebody knock on your door in a pandemic who's a total stranger, mask or no mask. And so all of those moments where they would have made those lightweight connections, those too were gone. We know that intimacy and human connection are really crucial to family, lovers, friendship, but they also play a crucial role in the workplace. Cruel bosses have long known that there is power in depriving workers of human connection. Right? So in Accounting for Slavery, Caitlin Rosenthal shows how actuarial and management processes were developed explicitly to undermine human connection. In modern times, we've seen technology use this, right? Like scheduling software has been used by cruel employers in order to ensure that workers never interact with the people same day over and over again so that they do not unionize. But when we think about technologies like Slack and Teams and email and Zoom, we imagine that this can connect people across distance. We hope to use these tools as such. But that doesn't benefit workers when every interaction is monitored, traced, and threatened to be revealed and out of context. Instead, all of the relationships that are necessary to maintain a trust in an institution like the Census Bureau, they start to wither. Distrust creeps across that network like mold. The joy and pleasure of connecting to people does not inherently require physical proximity, but how our worlds and opportunities are designed actually really matters in terms of those connections. I first learned this by studying teenagers. In a pre-pandemic world, teenagers loved technology, right? Because it allowed them to connect outside of the constant surveillance of adults, right? They were stuck at home. Their parents wouldn't let them go out hang with friends. They were stuck having dinner. And so they were text messaging behind, the conversation. Those were the connective tissues under a surveillance system. But of course, teenagers being stuck at home has meant that the surveillance system has just creeped in totally different ways. And so the technology is no longer pressure. It's now about trying to escape out of the physical proximity. But what people are looking for in a lot of these connections aren't about the high stakes moments where people are like, oh, they're going to go and have sex. Like, yes, of course, teenagers have sex, but that's not the point. So much of more of it is the mundane, the casual, the informal, the small pieces of human connection that define intimacy. And pre-pandemic, a lot of this occurred through technology, but for a lot of young people, it's now missing. And that's the thing, it's missing for so many adults too. It's not just those weak ties, but it's the little textures of intimacy. So as we look to the future, people dream grand dreams of seeing friends and traveling, going to parties, being around much people. IPK attendees, you desperately want grapes and cheese. But what we need to recover are actually those small connections, those moments of just human interaction that allow us to feel that sense of trust and respect and human dignity, the connections that allow us to recognize and reward each other's humanity. But unfortunately for federal government workers, it's not just that the telework issue is our new reality. It's not just that this hybrid thing is going to be with us forever. The Census Bureau workers, for example, have been told that the earliest they'll get to go into their offices is 2022. But even then, only 40% of them will even be given office space. So unlike teleworkers from industry, that means that their ability to connect with colleagues will continue to disintegrate because there will not be funding to fly them into like group-long week social events. They will be left on their own. And of course, that's depressing in some sense, and it's demotivating. It loses a lot of the reasons why you come in for mission-driven work. But let's also be clear, it's political. It's a desire to use the tools of disconnection, to use it under the guise of efficiency, to Eric's point, to use efficiency as a tool in order to dismantle the connections between people. And in the federal government context, that's in order to dismantle the federal government. There is political work in doing that. And that's where I ask us, how do we get back to those intimacies? Because those intimacies are what allow us to build trust. And if we don't work to build trust, we will lose our institutions with or without a pandemic. Thanks.
Dana, that's very powerful. I'm glad you brought the social part of our lives into the workplace very directly and into a politically in charge and important workplace. But clearly there's not a social sphere that's separated from labor. Labor is organized around all sorts of social things. And I think you and Paula and Meredith have all introduced the possibility that the kinds of adaptations we made to the pandemic, introduce new forms of inequality that could have real lasting effects. I want to take this occasion to bring in one of the questions that came through on the Q&A function. And I also want to invite everyone who's here, and basically everyone is still here. It's a good sign about the quality of the presentations. Please put your questions into that Q&A box, so we can get to them. But one of the questions is, have there been any compensatory new forms of interaction, new rituals that have broken through the ice of this moment? In addition to all the ways we know in which we've become distant from one another, have any of you seen us develop new forms of solidarity and connection, new ways of providing that human touch, even in difficult circumstances? Paul, the question was directed at you, so I'm going to start with you, but anyone can jump in on this.
Yeah, I think people try to do it all the time. I remember at the very beginning of the pandemic in Japan, people had figured out this way of doing like shoe bumps in lieu of handshaking, and we do fist bumps and so on. But I think it's easy to underestimate, and Dana made this point, the extent to which a lot of the basic human processes that people talk about as if they only occurred face to face can also occur over screens, but they're somewhat attenuated. They work best when they're reinforced by this kind of deep habitual face-to-face interaction. And if you have a deep relationship with somebody face-to-face, it's easy to turn on the screen and continue that interaction as if they were there. If you don't have that, then it becomes a lot harder. So for forging new relationships, I don't think that there's a good way of doing that.
I think about that in the context of the workplace as well. For all of the corporations out there that have gotten excited about the prospect of having, less office space, fewer in-person interactions, it's kind of one thing to remain steady state and to get work done during a one-year pandemic, but how do you establish some sense of camaraderie? How do you develop commitment to learn from each other, over the course of a project or career? How do you bring people into a firm? It seems to me like they're really big questions. about this model. There's a structural piece, that urbanists think about, which is at what level, can you cut back from all of these in-person activities and lose the kind of collective whole that's just, that sustains all these casual interactions, right? So if we don't get enough firms back and workers back into some parts of the central business districts, not just in New York, but in cities around the country, you could see the kind of commercial sphere, the social infrastructure that supports all those interactions falling apart, right? Getting boarded up. And so there is some concern that, we need to collectively produce conditions that allow for social interaction we value. Dana, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what's interesting is that I actually think that the technology mediated world, to Paul's point, is really strengthening existing strong ties. And those tend to be far more homogenous, right, in all sorts of different ways. But for societies to function at scale, to your point, we have to find ways of bridging ties that are differently heterogeneous. And as we're thinking about inequities as part of this panel, I think it's important to recognize that those are a form of social friction that are hard work to bridge differences. And the physical experience of really sitting down and seeing someone's humanity provides a different context by which you can actually start to do that hard work. Doing that hard work when you don't want to is a lot more challenging. And we see this even within families, right? So, you might not particularly like your uncle, so it's a lot easier to block them on Facebook than it is to skip talking to them at, Thanksgiving dinner. And those are these moments where physical actually forces us to listen and hear across difference and to find ways of engaging and bridging and to recognize humanity, because I'm going to assume most people aren't sociopaths. But that moment of that work and that hard work, that's what I worry about the most. But the thing about technology is we've seen that strong ties can be strengthened. And so how to hold on to both of those simultaneously is, to me, part of the equation.
Natasha, yeah.
Yeah, I guess I just want to chime in on the question that was asked, and I thought about it also during Paul's talk, that there's a way in which micro affirmations can actually happen in the form of social distance. I mean, I've been in remote rural upstate New York, but the couple of times I've been back in the city, I'm very touched by the fact that everyone I've encountered is wearing masks and sort of stepping aside as I walk. And I feel very cared for. And so there's a way in which, caring can be expressed through distance in a time like this. It's recognizing yourself in relation to another body, not necessarily just distrust of that other body. And I guess I also just wanted to say that, and I am utterly implicated in what I'm about to say, that if some of this is about inequality, right, I think we have to acknowledge who the we is that we have been talking about. The we in my remarks, the we of Meredith's future, and that's aside from saying you want to see racial justice, et cetera. But really what you were talking about in the vignettes, as with mine, and the we of Dana's workers and the we of the college students that Paul is talking about, are a cosmopolitan, educated, wealthy we. And I think it's important for us to this is a moment when we can sort of marvel over and reflect on these momentous changes that we has been experiencing. But there's so many other examples out there historically, but even in contemporary times. I'm thinking of migrant workers. I'm thinking of maids who live overseas for years and years and years and miss out on and basically they are executing a different kind of care at a distance and sending money remittances home and speaking to their children on the phone like once a month from the corner store. So I think that there's a way in which we can begin to humble ourselves in relation to this experience by thinking through those other experiences that have been sitting alongside of our cosmopolitan, wealthy, educated experience this whole while.
I appreciate that. I want to turn to Meredith, and it strikes me that we've focused, very much on this question of how our digital life has kind of taken over in the past year. But of course, one big thing that happened in the course of this past year with respect to kind of racial equality and some of the we's who are not on, in our reference group so far, is that there was, among the largest and most sustained set of social movement protests around Black Lives Matter and racial equity in our nation's history. In cities across the country, it was kind of interestingly, multi-ethnic, multiracial set of protests. A set of protests that has, quite likely changed something in the criminal justice system, and potentially more than that as well. We'll see. Meredith, you made the most explicit call for a future of social life that is more dedicated to this project of racial equity, but you also expressed some skepticism about how we deliver on it. How do you think about that kind of outpouring of kind of physical participation, at least for a few months over the summer? Does that signal something to you about a future we're heading towards?
Well, I am hopeful about a future that includes work toward greater racial equity. On the other hand, I am a Black woman living in America, and I have seen some shit. And so I'm not, if it gets better, then that's great. But I am also prepared for it to not get better.
Yeah, that's probably wise and realistic. So one last question that just came in from Bridget Marquis, who says, we've talked a lot about these divisions and kind of disconnections. We're also in a moment where we're debating how to build the most ambitious infrastructure project in our lifetimes. And Bridget wants to know, if there's certain kinds of ecosystems, maybe she means just physical, maybe she means physical and digital, but are there certain kinds of ecosystems that would actually be good for us for building new ties, for encouraging the promotion of weak ties, for supporting larger, more diverse networks? Is there a way that we can think about this moment as an opportunity, to explicitly build spaces that do the kind of work that you're all calling for? Dana?
I mean, I would say most certainly, and that's where realizing that physical engineering and social engineering are entwined. So, these are choices of how you bring people together. And, the one thing I will say against studying a government organization, bringing people together for a shared mission, and doing it in a way that they can communicate and find joy and pleasure out of each other, like they end up building social ties that help knit together the country. That is the story of the military. That is the story of college. That is the story of many things in which strangers are purposefully brought together for some form of shared purpose. And so the question for me is, like, as we look to all of these infrastructure commitments that we're committing to, how do we make that and recognize that this is also about building the social fabric alongside it, rather than seeing this as another opportunity to make it about reinforcing our particular variant of capitalism? And I worry about the latter because most of the time it's about doubling down on efficiencies rather than saying that actually putting friction to the system can build the social fabric that we all want.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Paul, does this enter into your teaching on social networks and the conversations you have with your students? Like, what kinds of places foster the weak ties that you think we need?
Probably not as much as it should.
Well, if we found an area that you haven't studied well, that we've really dug deep here. So Natasha, Meredith, any last words before we end for the evening?
I will say that on the topic of micro affirmations, it's been really lovely to see people developing ways to do these small affirmations in our socially distanced world. So the example that that somebody gave in the chat was the hugs far apart. And I was on a knitting Zoom the other day, and there was a young woman on it, and she made a little heart. at the end to say, oh, I had a really nice time being with all of you. And I thought that was such a lovely gesture by this young woman. And I hadn't seen that before. And so I love that people are endlessly creative with coming up with these kinds of things that say, hey, I feel connected to you.
And I guess I'll just end with a little view from deep rural upstate New York, where I have cultivated a wonderful relationship with my garbage man that didn't exist before. And so I'll go out there with my coffee and I look forward to when he's coming, and we'll have long talks in the road. And my delivery guy, and also that neighbors all up and down this road have been leaving each other more than usual amounts of applesauce and cookies anonymously, just on your doorstep. So more little micro affirmations and a sense of some kind of solidarity and hope.
I mean, in a way, for me, the very fact that we're on the precipice of, pushing through this infrastructure bill, represents a sign of a kind of solidarity and investment in ourselves that I would not have predicted a couple of years ago. It seems to me like the story of what COVID has done to us and what comes next is very much in production, which is one of the things that makes it such an exciting and also terrifying time to be alive. So thanks to each of you on the panel for participating tonight. It's a great conversation. I can't believe we're already over time. And thanks to everyone who's stayed with us on the call for so long. Hope to see you again, definitely in person before too long at IPK. And I wish all of you well. So good night, everyone.
Later.